So thank you everyone for being here. My name's Lee.
Alejandro.
We're from SCIRRT, so the International Librarianship panel of
Student
ALA,
chapter of the
ALA
International Roundtable.
Yeah. But we don't have a lot to do with the actual roundtable yet.
Mhm.
Kind of a new group. So we just thought Professor Bastian, she's already here and she's an amazing resource and she has a lot of really great writing that she's done and now this new book, so we were excited about that. So thank you all for coming out. I'll just read this brief introduction even though I'm sure everyone already knows Professor Bastian.
Not everyone.
But so she's, as you know, she's the Archives Management Program Director here. She's Professor of Archives. She's also served as the Director of SLIS West and as an Associate Dean and Acting Dean of SLIS and the previous iteration of USLAS. So before she came to Simmons, she was the Director and Territorial Librarian of the Division of Libraries, Archives, and Museums of the U.S. Virgin Islands. So she's also previously taught at the University of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and she's worked in a few different libraries there, so she has extensive library and archives experience. I don't think we could list her awards or consultancies or all the publications she's had, because there are many of them. But she is especially well known in the field for her work on community archives, colonial archives and colonization or decolonization, custody of archives and what constitutes a record, what constitutes an archive, collective memory, and graduate archival education. So, and feel free to add anything if you missed anything.
That's more than enough.
Right now she's teaching at archive history and collective memory.
Not in here. Next week.
Do you have your meeting here too?
Sometimes.
Okay, so she's taught, she teaches all the archives courses here at Simmons. And she's retiring at the end of this year, so that's why we really wanted to be able to have a conversation with her about the new book before she leaves Simmons. And also everyone should come to the Ellen Smith Symposium on April 12th and 13th. In her honor, it's the From Community to Curriculum, Translating Social Responsibility into Archival Education. So there's a lot of really amazing speakers who will be there.
Yeah.
Sure, if anyone has questions, Mr. Bastian can share more about that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So you had wanted to do this as a question kind of thing? So.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess we could just start. Can you tell us a little bit about the time?
Yes. So this is the book. I see you have it here. It's kind of a good doorstopper kind of book. Those are always good things. But it came about because several years ago, I was part of a group of people, invited group of people, who met in Jamaica to advise the Department of Library Science on creating an archives program. So there were, I guess there was about 5 or 6 of us all together. Most of the people were from the Caribbean. Anyhow, so it was all about kind of building this curriculum, and they had gotten a small grant from UNESCO to bring us all together. And so we talked, it was really interesting, and we spent several days and we talked about the curriculum and what an archives curriculum should be, because mostly people from areas of the world, like probably like the Caribbean, Africa, the Pacific Islands, get their degrees in archives in Canada or in the UK, sometimes in the United States. We had a student from Jamaica here I guess a couple of years ago. But there aren't a lot of places for people to learn to become archivists in the Caribbean. In fact, there aren't any, and so this is why they decided to start a Masters of Archival program. One of the things that we pretty much realized right away in designing a curriculum is that, you know, if we were going to just design a curriculum like the curriculum we have at Simmons, pretty standard, then we wouldn't, you know, they could just come here, or they could go to the University College London or Dundee or someplace else. So what is it that makes a curriculum specific to a region? And so we started to think about how do you design a culturally sensitive curriculum that makes sense to the people who live there. And of course, for an area like archives that is so locally specific, it's really an important aspect. So anyhow, we did over a couple of years, we designed this curriculum, which is now being taught. But then we realized we didn't have any texts. There are journal articles about Caribbean archives, very, very few. A lot of them are quite dated and old. And so some of us decided that we would create a text. So this is the text. And hopefully they will use it, but we also felt that it had a lot of, I think it has a lot of interest beyond the Caribbean, just because what is in this text is about archives, but it's really about all kinds of cultural heritage. It really kind of covers the cultural heritage of the Caribbean because, you know, that is kind of the archives. So that's how this came about. It took us 4 years. My two editors colleagues are both Jamaican. One is the retired National Archivist, John Aarons, and Stanley Griffin is the person who is the lead educator in that archives, in that Masters of Archival Science program. So, as I said, the 4 of us worked on it, and we were really happy when we finished because it had been a long time. So that's what I have to say about this, how this came into being.
Okay. Well, I guess that answers another question we had, which is how your work led you to this. So how would you describe, I guess, the content of, if you could describe the content of the book to someone who doesn't know a lot about archives, how would you?
Well, I think so. The focus, the focus is on this concept of decolonization, although we didn't specifically ask any contributors to write about decolonization, because just the fact that they were writing was in itself achieving that decolonization. You know, so I guess you might say our point of view was that because it was all the essays, almost, I would say maybe 80% of the essays are written by scholars and academics and archivists in the Caribbean in a way that is what the process of decolonizing is about. We invited, well, between the 3 of us, we really knew a lot of people. And we knew a lot of people in the Caribbean. And those who we didn't, and if there was a particular area like genealogy, there's an essay in the end about how to do Caribbean genealogy. We just wrote to people and asked them if they would be interested. And the nice thing was that people were just incredibly generous, and they were really interested in contributing. Of course, some people were interested in contributing and never contributed. But that's kind of the hazards of editing something, is that, you know, some people are really wonderful and they submit things, and some people string you along because they mean to submit things, but then actually they never quite get to it. So then you as the editor have to sort of decide when are you going to say, okay, that's it, you know, in a nice way.
Yeah.
But just going beyond that, I wrote another book I had written a long time ago in 2003 called Owning Memory, How a Caribbean Community Lost Its Archives and Found Its History. And I think that one of the issues, I mean, I think there's in you might say crossing cultural boundaries is there's a lot of difficulties. I think a lot of ethical issues and a lot of other issues because you don't want to sort of be in a position where you're reappropriating somebody else's culture. So when do you know where to draw lines between what you feel you're competent to deal with and what you feel you maybe is beyond you? It's somebody else has to do it. Maybe your job is to get somebody else to do it. And certainly in this book, I felt that my job was getting somebody else to do it. And it sounds, I mean, the editing is a huge, you know, it's a huge job. So just getting someone else to write it doesn't let you off the hook when you write something. So I have spent most of all of my professional career in the Virgin before coming to Simmons as a librarian and as an archivist in the Virgin Islands. And actually, I never really worked in the United States as a librarian or as an archivist. And so I was fortunate then in all these many years to become very involved with Caribbean libraries and Caribbean archivists. And so all of that, in a way, made it possible to talk about all, you know. And then having two colleagues who were Caribbean people, you know, also sort of really between, so the three of us then kind of brought different kinds of legitimacy to the whole thing, which I hope will, I mean, it just came out, so I haven't seen any reviews, so I'm saying these hopeful things, but who knows? But go ahead and just ask questions, which is
yeah. And if others have questions, you can jump in. We brainstormed with the group, but same
yes.
with if anyone comes online.
So you talk about a lot of the decolonization that takes place in the book and just the writing. So, and how it can be applied more broadly. So are you talking about that similar themes of decolonization can be used in archives in other areas that were once colonized?
Well, I think so. So you first have to start out with, well, so what does it really mean? What does decolonization really mean? People are sort of throwing this word around a lot lately. I mean, so people used to use post-colonialism, and then they realized that actually post-colonialism wasn't very, post-colonialism kind of implies colonialism in a sense, and so wasn't really a word that was very accepted by colonial people themselves. I mean, it was used by other people. So I would say that to decolonize something is all about changing the narrative. Changing the narrative so that the narrative is then the local narrative, that people then create or construct their own narratives of their history, of their culture, and sort of how they see themselves as a people going forward. And so it's not, so in other words, only the people from the place can themselves decolonize themselves. Somebody else can't come along and say, oh, we're going to decolonize. You were a nice little colony, but now we'll give you some freedom and we'll decolonize.
Yeah.
It's not really like that. It has to be people themselves, and the problem with archives is that archives are, very state-oriented. They were really incredibly implicit in colonialism and in creating boundaries, in defining people, in defining groups, in the Caribbean, for example, which was mostly colonized by the British, although, there are French islands and there's also Dutch islands. There would be a colonial office in London somewhere. The colonial office would send out memos, and every little island would do. So in other words, records kind of governed. Records and archives is what governed the place, what defined the place. And so now there's lots of these colonial records. I mean, if you think about it, think about plantations, think about slave lists of enslaved people. It's all about records. And so on the one hand, here are these records that are defining you. On the other hand, how do you find out about yourself without using those records? This is a very strange dilemma that on the one hand, you didn't create the records, someone created them about you. But at the same time, if you want to know about yourself, you're kind of tied up to those records. So it's a really complex situation and a complex relationship that I think that colonial people have with these records that they didn't create, but that were created about them. So I would say that, so how do you kind of free yourself? So maybe decolonizing is also freeing yourself from those colonial records and maybe deciding or constructing your own history and emphasizing those aspects of your history or finding those aspects of your own cultural heritage that belong to you, that weren't, part of this colonial mix. It doesn't necessarily mean that you just take all the colonial records and throw them away, but maybe you reuse them. So, for example, there's one of the essays in this book written by a historian at the University of West Indies in Barbados talks about reparations and using archival records of actually, it turns out to be records of his own ancestors to make reparations claims, and the kinds of ways you could look at the records and the kinds of things that you could use to ask for these kinds of reparations. So maybe one way to kind of figure out this relationship is saying, yes, there's all these colonial records and they're really full of very unpleasant things about me. And but how do I kind of twist it around and use them to my advantage? What can I do? But at the same time, not really feel like they're dominating. Maybe they're just a small piece. And so what are the records that you create? And so there's all kinds of, cultural, there's music, there's folk tales, there's material culture. There's so many cultural expressions that also, in a way, are also archives. So part of it, a part of this decolonizing business, I think, is kind of thinking really differently about what archives are, and not feeling bound by this kind of very master narrative approach that we learn, that archives, that's what, that we teach actually, and that everybody learns, where not that a lot of the countries in the Caribbean, they all have national archives, but perhaps they are thinking about collecting traditional things, but also very non-traditional things that kind of make up their culture. So I would say that decolonizing is really, as I said, about shifting that narrative so that it becomes your own local narrative that you can claim yourself, that you don't stop worrying about. But actually, one of the questions you asked was really interesting, and I was thinking about that a lot. And that is, does that really, so you have in the world places that have been colonized, and then you have this settler communities, which such as the United States, Canada, Australia, the United States, you have Native Americans, you have First Nations in Canada, you have Aboriginal peoples in Australia, you have Maori people in New Zealand, and I would say in Australia, the United States, and Canada, there's a real tension between those original inhabitants, those indigenous peoples, and the settlers, which can't be solved in the same way. I mean, so Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, yes, they're colonized, but then in the 1960s, they all become independent. So once they become independent, it's theirs. And then they can have these vestiges of colonialism, but also they're in charge. And so it's a lot easier to craft that narrative, to craft that local identity, to kind of recreate or create your identity. But for settler nations, for the indigenous peoples, it's really difficult because there is no line that says, okay, now we're on our own. You're always having to resolve or work with that terrible tension between these two different cultures. So I would say that decolonizing in that situation is, I think there are many attempts, many certain, Native American groups creating websites, people trying to revitalize their language, things like that. But it's really difficult, And the other thing about colonialism is that even though we're all colonized economically, I would say, So there's a lot of kinds of decolonization. So you might be decolonized culturally, but I think it becomes very difficult. I would say, nobody is free.
Yeah, there's neo-colonialism.
Oh yeah,
economic
yeah, and you see it kind of all around. So I mentioned owning memory because when I wrote that, it really was. It's basically about. So in the Virgin Islands, and I think I mentioned this to my class, that so the Virgin Islands was colonized in around 1660 by the Danes. The Danes then, brought in enslaved peoples, had a lot of sugar plantations, and so had this plantation economy for a couple of hundred years, and created a lot of records. So all the records, and then when they decided to sell the Virgin Islands to the United States in 1917, they sent all their records to Denmark. So there weren't any records. 200 years worth of records, because the Danes felt we created the records, our offices created the records, and so therefore they belong in our national archives. So working in the Virgin Islands as a librarian, it became really frustrating because people would keep coming into the public library. It was public library. People kept coming into the public library and they wanted historical things. I mean, they wanted to know about genealogy, and they had all of these questions that we could never answer because we didn't have any records. And if we requested records from the Danish archives, like reels of microfilm, they would charge us. I mean, charge you for your own records. Yeah. And, you know, so when I decided to go to get a PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, what I was really interested in was finding out, so how did this situation happen and why did it happen? And is it really true that these records don't belong to the Virgin Islands, they belong to Denmark? And so that's what I investigated. And then afterwards, and then eventually wrote this book because, so I ended up, so one of the things I did is I did a lot of interviews with Virgin Islanders about how they felt about their, so in other words, how does a community know about its history if it doesn't have any records? So what do? If they don't have any records, how is there, do they need the records? How do they learn about themselves? How do they create their own identity without any history? And so I interviewed a lot of people. I mean, I did a lot of different kinds of things, but one of the things was interviewing people to see how they felt about their history and how they, whether they felt the loss of these records or whether they had another way of constructing their history. And, you know, and I looked at like dissertations people had written people to see, okay, if they don't have, because so you could say, okay, you could go to Denmark, but not everybody can really buy a ticket and fly. And then, of course, all the records are in Danish anyway. Some people have gone to Denmark. And so anyway, in 1917, the Danes took the records, and then the Virgin Islands, I've just used the Virgin Islands as just an example, and then the Virgin Islands was under the Department of the Navy in the US Navy after they were purchased. Now they're under the Department of the Interior. But people used to come periodically and take the records and take them back to the National Archives of the United States. So, because they were claiming, well, you know, you're a territory of ours, and so therefore the federal government owns your records. And finally, I think in the 1950s, people said, okay, this is enough, we've had it, do not take any more records. And they stopped taking records. So if you're a historian, you have to, you know, you go to Denmark, you go to the National Archives, it becomes a real problem. So to me, it was really, I really wanted to know how people kind of confronted or dealt with their history when they didn't have any access. And so what do you think people would do? So, you know, here you are, you don't have any records telling about your history. Maybe there are some history books, but some of them are very anecdotal because they're depending on secondary sources. So are there other ways that you access history? Oral history? Yeah, so that's exactly what people did and still do actually. So it's really, yeah, so people access history in a much more oral, kind of anecdotal way, and yet there's a kind of problem with that. And the problem with that is that you can never, without the records, you really can't ever verify anything. It's just hearsay. It's not exactly hearsay. Maybe it's a little above hearsay, but you never really know. And anyhow, so I'm just kind of throwing that out.
So you mentioned including, I guess, other types of objects or, let's say, events as part of the record was a move towards, let's say, recording performances, parades, art performances of that kind. A move to sort of supplant the historical record ever? Was that ever a sort of means?
I think there was, so there's always the feeling that, oh yes, there is this history, but it's in Denmark. So we really can't get to it. So we'll just have to deal with what we know. And I think, so I'm not, so I think, there were bare outlines of history, and of course people have written history books. But as far as getting into the details, it's always been
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also, kind of depends on what the society thinks is a record. Maybe documents aren't always the only kind of record to think about. And in fact, there's a little essay of mine in here, which I reprinted from something I'd written for Archival Science about carnival, and thinking about a carnival parade as a record,
Mm-hmm.
which I think it is. So anyhow, so this is the kind of thing I'm interested in, which is thinking about records in a non-traditional kind, as more in terms of cultural expression, rather than very strictly thinking, record just stuff.
What other kinds of records are explored in the collection?
Music is, so music's huge in the Caribbean, and in a very, very creative kind of way. And there's several things. There's this person, he's called the reggae archivist. I guess he is a reggae archivist. He himself is not a reggae archivist. He just collects things from reggae. So he has this huge archive of reggae artists, and that is actually famous worldwide, and people, particularly, focusing on Bob Marley and Bob Marley's connections. And you can go online actually, and you can see his archive. And he actually, I think, lives in California, but he spent many, many, many years in Jamaica. And he has this, every album, every iteration, every recording, every transcript of, particularly of Bob Marley's, but also, as I said, he's kind of branched out into the rest of the Marley family, and all the connections and people that he sang with. So there's that, and then also a very long essay about just music written by a music archivist. So yeah, so music, I would say carnivals. There's a couple of essays about thinking about carnivals and parades in an archival way, one written by me, one by a person who's actually a librarian at the University of West Indies, Trinidad. Then I think artifacts. There's one about so before anybody came to the Caribbean, before the colonists and the enslaved came to the Caribbean, there were indigenous people, and so there are also archives, stones, various kinds of markings and things like that. So there's an essay about that. I'm trying to think of what is even in this book now. I tried to forget about it once it was done.
Once it was done, you just took it off of your plate entirely.
I thought there was one about a community radio station, I think, or like a.
In Haiti, yes,
Yeah,
yes, exactly. A yes, a radio station in Haiti that is all about in French Creole, in that Haitian Creole. So this kind of more oral kind of archive. There's also one about, so one of the things that I did is I invited former national archivists of different countries who now have retired to talk about, and these national archivists were the people who started the archives in their particular countries, to talk about their experiences and coming up and what they found and how they built the archives. So that is, and then one of them we did as an oral, the person in the Bahamas we did as an interview, but the others are just kind of reminiscent. So there's several, so at the beginning there's several, there's a lot about reminiscence. There's several of these, like 5, I think. There's one about natural disasters, hurricanes. There's some about oral tradition and kind of matching oral traditions to records. So there's some things about kind of the traditional archives and actually a history of the archives. But then others about, there's a great article called Maroons in the Archives, the Uses of the Past in the French Caribbean, which is about Martinique. And this was, so there were 3 essays that, I mean, all the essays were, all 40 essays were original, except for 3, so 37 were original, but 3 I reprinted. So one is this Maroons in the Archives, which is about Martinique, and this mural that depicts kind of the history. So it has a sort of wall art and as accessible history. One is written by a professor in Jamaica about how so I guess some heritage society in Kingston decided to build memorials throughout the country and on the memorial, so the memorials would be the memorials to the Maroons, to various groups who had combated slavery. But on the memorials, they also wrote the history. So they wrote dates and when. So in other words, the memorial was a memorial, but it was also an archive, which for people who, are not going to read the history, but people in this little town will probably look at the memorial. So these are all kinds of different ways of creating records and different ways in which people access records, ways that are comfortable to them. And I think that's kind of that decolonizing part too, is what is the way that people themselves not just want to create records, but how do they want to access and find records? How do they want to find out about themselves? Maybe they want to find out about themselves through stories or through music or through carnival parades. Maybe that's how people want to understand who they are. Because that's, archives are all about story. Okay, any questions I didn't answer?
There's one that you have, or I think you've touched on a lot of the questions that we had, but another one that came up, I'm not sure if this was in the version that I sent you, so this might be new. But you have already talked about it. So I know, especially in the Caribbean, how slavery, the institution of slavery and colonialism were so intertwined. So I guess how that comes out in the records and the archives. That's a question.
Yeah, so well, I mean, in a lot of different ways. There's been this battle gone on for several years. So in the British colonies, the records that were created were all, of course, sent to colonial office in London. And wasn't just the British colonies, but British colonies in Africa as well. And a couple of years ago, somebody discovered, in a cupboard somewhere, all of these records that were all about this colonial history. And kind of were gaps, in a sense, in people's own understanding. Some of them were records from the Caribbean, and some of them were records from different African nations. So all these nations said, hey, wow, you discovered all these records. Can we have them? We want them. And the British government said, no, they belong to us. You can't have them. You can come and look at them, but you can't have them. And apparently they weren't going to make copies either. So, so these are sort of the kind of results. These are some of those kind of records results of colonialism. I mean, in terms of the Virgin Islands, the Danish government for this in 2 years ago, in 2017, the centennial of the transfer, the Danish government scanned a whole lot of records and kind of put them up on its website as a gift to the Virgin Islands. But would never give them back, And I do think that there's a lot of value to having the original. Even if it's in a language you don't understand, at least you can always learn Danish, or you can find a translator. I don't think that's really
part of it is
obstacle.
ownership. I mean, it's this ownership of your own past.
Exactly. That's what it's doing. Yes. So I'm not sure that a scan kind of meets that level, really. And I think, yeah, exactly. That you want the ownership of the original. So in terms of the relationship between slavery and colonialism, I mean, colonialism is basically all about slavery. And, grabbing all these territories in the 17th century and establishing plantations and the triangular trade. But so what, so records of huge numbers of plantation records, all kinds of slave records, and, buying and selling and transferring, and all of these kinds of things. It just kind of goes on and on. So I mean, it's completely entwined, actually. Yeah.
So, what would you say is the image that National Archives and I guess records repositories have in a lot of these Caribbean nations, like the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Well, I wouldn't say, don't bring the U.S. Virgin Islands in because they're not doing too well with their archives. But other countries in the Caribbean, I think, that I think that in a way the national archives of different countries really make a huge effort. So the records they have are basically the records since independence, and some older records as well. But I think they really, the archives really try to bring in, to think about these non-traditional kinds of records as well, and to make those, and to realize that they're part of the national story. I think actually national archivists feel very, committed. If you're a new country, a new nation, people sort of seem to be very much against the idea of nationalism. But I'm not quite sure what people mean by nationalism. But I think if you're a small country, maybe nationalism is really important. And And so I think archivists and the archives feel a huge commitment to, I mean, to me, this is what I really have always loved about the Caribbean, is that people are really committed to their place. And I feel among, at least Caribbean, academics and archivists, they're very, very committed to documenting their place. So, and not so worried about these colonial archives. They kind of say, okay, go ahead, stay over there. And really, what's really important to me isn't those colonial. I mean, I think, again, it's that, like in Australia, those, you might call colonial records are incredibly important, and people really want access to them because this business for children and taking children that happened in the United States as well. So again, I think you have to really make that distinction.
Yeah, that's why we were curious on your thoughts about settler colonial versus.
Yeah, I think that, I think particularly in Australia and Canada, there's a lot of articles in Archivaria and Archives and Manuscripts. A lot of the archivists really, worry about this and try to work with indigenous communities to sort of try to sort things out, because there's been so many incredible injustices done to people.
So, anyone?
Oh, excuse me.
Does anyone else have questions, or from online? Anyone online? Feel free to type in your questions if you have any.
You might be able to speak through there if there's a microphone on.
Oh, or maybe you can speak into your microphone if you can turn that on. I don't know. Feel free to chime in.
Yeah. We briefly mentioned the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I'm assuming when you said earlier that the situation over at the National Archives or the archives at the U.S. Virgin Islands, it's not that great right now.
It's really no, so it's best not to discuss it.
Okay.
While I was the territorial director, we did start the archives actually, and but it has run into a lot of issues. So I don't think it is typical of other islands. I mean, I think other people, other archives in the other islands, they struggle, but they kind of make it happen, and somehow we haven't. I mean, the Virgin Islands has not been able to do too well.
Okay. So you also mentioned national disasters and hurricanes. I was wondering if you could speak to how records keeping affects, I guess, this program of building of records. Like how might let's say a disaster like Hurricane Maria affect?
Yes. So one of the problems, I think, in the Caribbean, being a librarian or an archivist in the Caribbean, is that in some ways, because every year there are hurricanes, you're always either recovering from a hurricane or you're preparing for one. Yeah. And even if it's not going to show up, you never really know. There is an article in here by the archivist in Montserrat, where they not only have this hurricane disaster, but they also have a volcano. So they're in particularly bad kind of situation. But working as a librarian, we had some major hurricanes. The first one was in 1989, Hurricane Hugo. I mean, that I was involved with. Our house was destroyed. I was in the house while it was destroyed, and the libraries on St. Thomas were fine, but the libraries on St. Croix were completely destroyed. I mean, actually everything was destroyed. And so it takes years and years. That's the trouble, you see. The thing about hurricanes is, yes, they're really awful when they happen. But what's really the worst is the recovery just takes years. And, you know, so, and I'm sure Puerto Rico is, you know. And the other thing is, it's not like on the top of everybody's list, too. You know, it's, I mean, because all the people who work in the archives or the library also have homes and also have families. So it's not as if, oh, we have this disaster, let's all get together and do something, because everybody also has to take care of their own issues in the disaster. So, so it's hard to kind of get ahead because you know, and it's very hard to build something that's completely hurricane proof, because in a way hurricanes are, you never quite know, like this recent severe and Irma, yeah. So the power goes out. And it's not so years ago when everything was destroyed in St. Croix, I went over. We could only get over there by boat. We finally got over there, and after a while, after some time, so FEMA finally showed up, and I remember going with this person to one of the libraries that was there. And I mean, it hadn't been opened a week. So we opened it, we actually had to close it immediately because it was all mowed. The whole place had to be really knocked down. So this guy from FEMA says, well, you know, he had gone from one disaster to another. Apparently that's what he did. He said, oh, I was out in the Midwest and taking care of these libraries. And you know, and they had this flood. And so what the library did is they put everything into a refrigerator truck and they moved it to the library. So I just kind of looked at him because we hadn't had electricity for several months by that time. So, you know, where's this refrigerator truck? You know, where is this library down the road? So part of the problems with hurricanes and islands is that when you're on an island, that's it. And you don't have other resources. You can't tap in to a power line somewhere, you know, tap into the grid, another grid somewhere else. And this last hurricane, you know, it seemed to me personally that part of the problem they were having in Puerto Rico is that people going to Puerto Rico didn't really understand that Puerto Rico had no reason, couldn't do anything. You know, they kept saying, oh, we'll bring the ships in with the stuff and someone will unload and someone will take this and someone will move it somewhere else. But there weren't those resources to do that. You know, this is an island that's been destroyed. There's no place to get those resources. So this is part of the, you know, so this is kind of part of the issue with hurricane. It doesn't just happen and then go away, and you you know, live with it for a long time. So I don't know if that answers your question about hurricanes. So I, you know, as I said, I don't know what the situation is in Puerto Rico now, but with their archives, but it sounded to me like the University of Puerto Rico was kind of stepping in and taking care of some of the records and things. That's it. Any other questions? Have I answered your questions?
I have a last question if no one else has any to contribute. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah. I was going to say that you would even.
Yeah,
there are a couple people.
Oh, one.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
One was me.
Oh.
Okay, one person. Well, that's very nice. Yes.
I guess I would want to hear if you know of some, or I haven't gotten the chance to read the whole book.
No, but
If
that's.
there,
How dare you? You don't have. It's not. It's a reader. So a reader means that you just kind of dip in and you read something.
Yeah.
And then a year later, you dip in and you read something else.
Yeah. You know some successful stories of either repatriation or reparations that have involved archives?
Yes, there's actually a success story here, and it has to do with the archives of Suriname. Does everyone know where Suriname is?
No.
No. Okay, so Suriname is at the top of South America, but for some reason, which I don't understand, it's considered part of the Caribbean. And they were colonized by the Dutch. So at a certain point, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Dutch took all the archives that the records that they had created to move them to the Netherlands. And at that time, they made an arrangement with the archivist, with the government, that they would, the records essentially would be on loan to the Netherlands. But at the point when Suriname could build its own archives, they would return them. And so they actually, and so several years ago, that's what they did. They actually, Suriname built an archives and has an archivist, and all the records, the original records, were all returned. So that's a successful story of repatriation.
Was there a fight about that? Like,
No. This had been part of the arrangement.
Okay.
And they actually did it.
And they.
No, I'm surprised that the country didn't try to fight it anyway.
And they did it.
We're used to the stories about Britain.
It's not the same as the stories about England, right? Not Britain, that the UK that won't return things.
Well, I'm also thinking about, is it Iran or Iraq that has a whole bunch of their stuff in the US, and they keep asking for it back. I think we talked about it in one of your classes, and they keep asking for it back, and the US is like, nah.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, it's not just Britain, we do that, and other countries do that. So
about a year and a half ago, the ICA, the International Council on Archives, formed this group of people to sort of study this issue of repatriation, to see what they call displaced records, to kind of see, I guess, what all the issues are and what things could be done about them. I'm a member of this group. We haven't really done very much because I think so UNESCO and the International Council on Archives has been kind of working on this problem for years. It's not just a US problem or a UK problem. It's throughout the world because there's a lot of ways that archives get displaced, like in wars, for example. You know, people come in and they take the records because the records of a country are often are kind of part of the spoils of war. And so then the records get taken somewhere else, but then they never get returned. So it's not just colonialism that displaces records. There are a lot of different ways in which records kind of move around and get sort of untethered from where they really belong. So it's a worldwide problem. But there are a few successes, you see. I mean, the Netherlands, that's the only one I can think of. But there are a few. And she actually, the archivist, wrote an essay about it, which is in here somewhere. So that's really cool.
Would it be amazing if someday, using the records, there can be a successful case of reparation?
That would be nice.
To know when that
We can wish.
Yeah. So I hope I've answered questions, and
thank you so much.
and you're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. Bye-bye.